Good morning. Welcome to the third in the series of free workshops that we've done here on the farm. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Karen Velez. I'm the owner of Just Grow Something Garden Consulting and Education and half owner of Wolf Creek Family Farm where you are today. I started gardening about 20 years ago in a corner of my suburban backyard of our duplex, and we transitioned to 5-acre homestead where I expanded that garden to a 1/4 acre and then a 1/2 acre, and then we started growing for the public. And now here we are 17 years later, and we are on a 40-acre market farm here, and so that's what I do for a living. I also have my degree in horticulture from Oregon State University, and so I've been using that education plus my experiences here on the farm and growing for the past 20 years to teach other people how to grow their own food. So my two main missions are feed people and teach people how to feed themselves. So today's workshop is on the fundamentals of transplanting. We're going to talk about two different types of transplanting. One being potting up or up-potting your seedlings that you have started yourself into larger containers before they go out into the garden. And then the second part being transplanting those into the garden, whether you have started them yourself or you've bought them from a nursery or a greenhouse or something like that. We're going to include information about hardening off those transplants. So to start with, when you are potting up seedlings that you have started yourself, it's not always necessary to do this. If you're starting seeds that are fairly quick growing or are only going to be inside for a very short period of time before they go outside, it may not be necessary to pot those up. If you start them in a container that is large enough to begin with, you can generally leave them in there if they're only going to be in there for about 4 weeks before you put them out in the garden. So things like lettuces, broccoli, cauliflower, those really early ones, you can start them in the size container that you're going to transplant them out into the ground in. When we're talking about things that have to get started early because they're a warm season crop and they need that time to grow inside, and you're trying to start a lot of them and they're tiny seeds, so tomatoes for example, a lot of the time we're starting those in containers that are much smaller than what those tomato plants are going to need before they go out into the garden. Mostly that's to save space, especially if we're using a heat mat to help start those seeds. So you oftentimes are starting them in a plug tray that might have 50 cells to it or might have more than that, and those cells are tiny, and that's not enough room for the amount of time that seedling is going to have to be indoors, because oftentimes we're looking at 8 weeks before those can go outside. So we'll need to pot them up into larger containers. It is possible to transplant them directly from that plug tray out into the garden, but the plants are going to be much smaller, especially if you haven't thinned them out. And I'll show an example of that later because I still have some in here that I haven't potted up yet that are desperate to get out of their little containers. Too many things going on at once. The benefit to that for the plant is it has more room to be able to expand its roots, which means you're going to have larger growth up top. It also means that you're going to have to water less frequently because you have a larger volume of soil that can hold on to that moisture that the plant can feed off of, in addition to the nutrients. If you feed them while they're in their seedling stage, which if they're inside for 8 weeks, they likely are going to have to get fed at least once before you put them outside. Well, the larger volume of soil can hold more nutrients that the plant can feed off of, and therefore you're not having to feed them every single week while they're in their little pots. You can do it once. They can feed off of that for the time being before you put them out into the ground. When we pot up young seedlings, we want to make sure, with the exception of a handful of plants, that we are keeping the soil line the same. So wherever that plant sprouted within the soil, you want to keep that soil line the same when you pot it up into a bigger pot. You don't want to bury it any deeper on most plants because that is going to lead to the possibility of there being too much moisture around that stem and rotting it at the stem. So with the exception of tomatoes and peppers and eggplant, tomatoes mainly. Tomatoes you actually want to plant as deep as you possibly can when you pot that up. So I start with an empty container and I will take my seedling and drop it into that empty container to where the soil mass is the only mass of soil at the bottom, and then fill in from there lightly, pat it down, and water really well. Because everywhere that stem is for the tomato plant under the soil, where it's in contact with that soil is going to root. And so you'll get a much stronger root system before you even get it out into the garden. The same thing can be said for peppers and eggplant. I don't tend to plant them quite as deep. I usually do it about halfway. Not as deep as the tomatoes, but deeper than my other ones. Things like, like your early brassicas, broccoli and cauliflower and things like that, if you're having to pot them up, oftentimes they're gonna look kind of leggy because they naturally just sort of look that way. You can bury just a little bit of that stem into the soil to help shore them up a little bit if you're potting them up, but you don't want to do it completely like you do a tomato, because again, it might rot the stem. So those are the main points as far as when you're potting up into a larger container. Just be careful not to overwater. This goes for all of your seedlings, but you want to make sure that you're not overwatering it, because number one, there are fungal diseases like damping off that like to form on that cool, wet soil, and so that could actually kill off your seedling. Number two, you also don't want those seedlings getting used to constantly being watered all the time, because at some point they're going to have to go outside and they're not going to have that water all the time. Also, if you overwater or you water too frequently, you're not training those roots to go down to search for the water. They're going to stay up at the surface instead. So just like when we're outside in the garden, less frequent, more thorough waterings with our seedlings and our transplants are what we want to go for. So some of the benefits of using transplants instead of using seeds, direct sowing. There are plants that you can plant directly out into the garden from seed that are going to do just as well as they would if you were transplanting them. Things like cucumbers, squashes are larger seeded things that sprout readily, fairly quickly, grow fairly quickly, really only need a couple of weeks to get established. Those can just as easily be planted directly from seed out into the garden versus starting them indoors. The reason why you might want to do that is you get a better chance of sort of beating the competition from the weeds if you're transplanting a larger plant versus putting a seed in the ground. Because if you're putting a seed in the ground and you have any kind of weed pressure whatsoever, you're having to be very careful when pulling those weeds to not disturb that seed or that very baby seedling from, just disturbing it within the soil. If you have a larger plant, it's much easier to weed that entire bed, get that plant into the ground, and it's already large enough to be able to weed around it if you have those weeds popping up. Now, hopefully you're using mulch, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but that's one of the reasons why you might choose transplants instead of doing direct sowing from seeds. Some plants, depending on the area that you're in, you absolutely need to do from transplants. In our climate, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, things that need a long, warm growing season, you're less likely to get as much of a harvest if you're trying to do them from seed out into the garden. It's not to say that you can't. You can wait until the soil temperatures are warm enough and you can direct sow tomatoes right out into the garden and allow them to come up. But if you start them indoors or you buy them already started from a nursery and you transplant them in at the same time when that soil has gotten warmed up, you have an 8-week head start on your plants, which means you're going to harvest probably 8 weeks earlier. So instead of harvesting in July, like we normally sort of do here, well, if you direct sow them, you may not be harvesting until the very end of August.
Oh, wow.
And then you only have, until maybe the middle of October to get that harvest in. So if you're growing determinate tomatoes, that's actually not a bad strategy for the fall. So since determinate tomatoes only have harvestable fruit for about 3 weeks or so, and then they're kind of done, they put it on all at once, you can do some directly from seed at the same time that you're growing your other tomatoes and allow them to come up naturally for a fall harvest. You only have about a 3-week window of harvest on those anyway, so planting them when the time is right and waiting for them to come up and be harvested later on isn't going to lose you anything. It might actually save you some effort in terms of starting seeds indoors or trying to track down the specific variety that you want to grow. So those are some benefits to transplanting. Unfortunately, there are some plants that suffer a little bit more from transplant shock than others. Cucumbers is one of those. So if you're starting cucumbers indoors yourself or you're buying transplants, try to find ones that are being grown in biodegradable containers where you can just take the entire thing and plop it straight into the ground. They do not enjoy having their roots disturbed. They will suffer from transplant shock initially, and sometimes they may not recover. Sometimes they may just completely keel over and you don't get them back. So So if you can do direct sowing of cucumbers, great. But if you need to beat out those weeds, or you've got to find a way to beat the cucumber beetles or whatever, and you need to do transplants, then try to find one or grow one that's in a compostable, or a biodegradable container. Key considerations before transplanting: number one is selecting the right time to transplant. And in some place like Missouri, where the spring weather can be incredibly volatile and not know what it's doing, this can be kind of hard to decide sometimes. I have a lot of gardeners who are like, oh, is it okay to plant yet? Can we plant yet? Can we plant yet? The best way to determine this is by your soil temperature. The air temperature, like right now, it is beautiful. It is 60 degrees outside. It is sunny. It's fantastic. Our overnight low tonight is going to be 37. And that is not conducive for growing tomatoes. Air temperature aside, the soil temperature is what's going to determine even more how well your plants do. For example, tomatoes and other warm living crops like that, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, I keep referencing those, but those are the three common, warm weather ones. Any temperature, it's been shown, any soil temperature below 50 degrees can actually damage that root system. And for every hour below 50 degrees in the soil, it takes 8 hours for the plant to recover from that 1 hour. So if you have an overnight low, that's in the 30s, what do you think that soil temperature is like? The soil really knows the truth. Your air temperatures may be 85 degrees one day and 60 degrees the next or whatever, but that soil is going to take longer to warm up in the spring. There's two reasons for this. Number one, there's a lot of water volume being held in that cool winter soil. So most of the heat that's being generated from the sun at that point is going to drying out that soil. It's not actually heating the soil up at that point until the soil has started to dry out. So if you feel like the soil, the air temperatures are warm enough, you need to test that soil to make sure that you're not getting this sort of false sense of security. The second thing is, if you have good layers of mulch on there, it's also going to remain cooler in the spring. So if you are planting cool weather crops, this is a fantastic thing, because those crops don't like that soil temperature to warm up too quickly. It can actually cause them to bolt in combination with the weird back and forth warm air. So if you're trying to warm that soil up in the spring because you're waiting for warm weather crops to go in, this is the time when I do advocate for pulling that mulch back and letting the sun penetrate that soil to dry it out a little bit. And then once it is sort of dried out, then more of that heat is going to be trapped into that soil. If you're going to take your soil temperature, you want to take it at about the 4 to 6 inch mark. That is where the majority of our plant roots are going to be. So if you're transplanting, 4 inches is ideal, because that's about where you're going to dig that root ball anyway. You want the soil to be appropriate for whatever it is that you're transplanting. So if you're transplanting in the early spring and you're doing things like lettuces, kale, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kohlrabi, all of those cool season crops that are being transplanted, you want that soil to be a minimum of 45 degrees, preferably closer to 50 degrees at the 4 inch mark before you transplant. Can you transplant earlier? Yes. In terms of germination, lettuces, for example, will germinate at temperatures as cool as 40 degrees, which means they can also grow on at temperatures that are as cool as 40 degrees in the soil. But you're going to have a little bit more in the way of transplant shock, and there's no guarantee that that soil is going to be at that temperature for an extended period of time if you're planting that early in the season. There are still some possibilities that soil is going to cool back down again. So I always say 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit is the best for the cool season crops. When you're looking at warm season crops, you want the minimum temperature at which a tomato really will start growing is that 57 degree mark in the soil. That's the minimum. That's the bare, oh gosh, I can finally grow sort of condition. It's not ideal. Ideally, you want it above 60 degrees. I generally wait until 65 Fahrenheit before I will start transplanting any of that warm stuff. And again, that's at the 4 inch depth. And it's very easy to test the soil. You can use a meat thermometer if you want to. That's fine. I have a designated soil thermometer. I think it cost me $10 on Amazon. And it's the proper length, so I know when I push it down in and I leave that button up just enough, I know I'm hitting the correct depth down in there. And I can always have it with my gardening stuff, so when I can go out and I can pop, because your raised beds are going to warm up at a different rate than your in-ground soil.
Do they usually warm up quicker?
They will.
Okay.
Yeah, they will warm up more quickly, but they will also cool down more quickly too. So you have to know that your weather is sort of settled before you make the decision like, okay, this is actually what the temperature is going to be. I also recommend checking that soil temperature a number of times during the week and then sort of averaging it out to figure it out, to make sure that it's staying at about the level that you want it to be. Because if you do it too early, it's going to be fluctuating back and forth, back and forth. There's also an online resource that I will send the link to. It's through Syngenta, but it's called Greencast Online. And actually, you can type in your zip code, and it will give you the current soil temperature at the 2-inch depth for your area. Oh. And it will also give you all the historical data for that depth. So yes, it's only at the 2-inch depth, but it does give you an idea of exactly where the soil temperatures are and if they're trending upward and maintaining. You can also look to see whether or not that's normal for your time of year. Or is it actually like warmer or cooler this year than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago or for the average? So it's a really good tool to use to kind of help you figure out when is a good time to go ahead and put those plants out. A lot of gardeners will rush to get those early warm weather plants in. They're itching to get them in, and I totally understand it, especially if you're in an area where it has a very short growing season. You really want to get them in as early as possible. But I have done the experiment. We've planted tomatoes on April 15th. And then we've planted them on May 15th and watched the difference between the two. And even though the air temperatures were warm enough during April for us to be able to put those tomatoes out, and we didn't lose anything to frost, they didn't recover from the transplant shock nearly as quickly. They didn't grow as fast. They stayed shorter for longer than the ones that went in May. The ones that went in May recovered very quickly from their transplant shock and immediately began to shoot up and grow stronger. The harvest window was almost exactly the same. We started harvesting from those April planted plants at almost the exact same time we started harvesting from the ones that were planted a full month later. And the ones that were planted in May, those plants were much stronger, they were healthier, and they were better able to resist the diseases, the foliar diseases that we normally see in this area in our tomatoes, way better than those other ones that were planted in April. That was all I needed to see. So I have learned to slow my roll a little bit and go, okay, nope, not time to do that. I will just spend my time prepping my beds before actually going out there and actually planting something. Make sure that your beds are ready in advance. I always recommend soil tests. I think I talk ad nauseum about soil tests. Soil tests and mulch. Those are like my two things that I talk about way too frequently. But it's very true. If you can test in the fall and make any amendments at that point, that's the best idea. Because it gives the winter time, for that soil to absorb those nutrients and for them to start to break down to be in a form that's available to those plants come spring. And then you don't have to worry about it. You can test again in the spring to see if there's any more adjustments that need to be made before you start planting. Either way, I always say test in spring, because then you know whether or not your soil is deficient in some way, shape, or form, and you know whether or not you can need to use either a slow release or a fast acting amendment or fertilizer to be able to get your soil to the point where it is prepped and ready to go. So while you're waiting for that soil temperature to warm up, that's the time to be making sure that your beds are prepped. Break them up a little bit, loosen them up, turn whatever soil you need to do, add whatever amendments and fertilizers you need to, and then prepare your mulch. Make sure that your mulch is at the ready. If you're doing cool season plants, go ahead and throw that mulch on right away. It'll help keep that soil cool before you get them in. If you're waiting on warm season plants, then pull that mulch back and allow the sun to penetrate into that soil and allow it to warm up so you can get planted a little bit more quickly. It may not be that the air temperatures are quite ready, but at least your soil temperature will be ready to go. So when the air temperature settles, then boom, you can go ahead and start planting. So after you have your beds prepped and you're ready to go ahead and transplant, you want to harden off your plants. Hardening off your plants is the practice of getting them used to the outdoor conditions before you put them in their permanent little homes. So whether you have started them yourself indoors or you've gotten them from a nursery, you generally don't know what the nursery has been doing with them before you get them and bring them home. So don't assume that they have hardened those plants off. Don't assume that they haven't just been inside in their greenhouse until they threw them outside to sell you. Especially if you're buying plants at like a big box store in their garden center. A lot of the time, those plants are being sold on consignment. So the box store doesn't buy a whole truckload of plants necessarily and put them out there. They don't own them. So they're not as concerned with the care of them at that point, because if they don't sell, they don't lose anything. The company that has them on consignment loses something. So they may not be bringing them in when the temperatures get too cold for those warm weather plants, which can actually cause them to be stunted when you bring them home, and you'll have no idea of knowing. So I always recommend buying from like a local nursery if you can. If it's somebody that's a small, provider in your area, you have better options of being able to ask them questions and find out how those plants have been treated, if they've started them, if they've gotten them from other local growers, whether or not they've been hardened off, etc., etc. Even your local farmers market, most of those vendors are growing their own stuff, or they know where those plants have come from and they can tell you about that. But I always say, even when you bring them home, even if they've been hardened off by somebody else, you always want to acclimate them in some way, shape, or form. So if you started them from seed on your own and you're bringing them out of your own house, whether it's your basement or you have a little greenhouse or whatever, you're going to take a little bit longer, about 7 to 10 days, to get these plants used to where they're going to be out in the garden. If you bring them home from someplace else, I say take at least 3 or 4 days, unless you know for sure that it hasn't been hardened off, and then do it the exact same way you would if you were bringing them out of your basement. I will say, try not to buy plants too early and then bring them home and bring them into your house and let them wait. Because if they have been hardened off prior to that, you have just undone that process by bringing them home and putting them inside and letting them wait. So if you do that, then you're going to have to kind of start that hardening process off again. Otherwise, they are definitely going to suffer from some transplant shock, and they may not even survive, because now all of a sudden they've gone from being outside to being inside. Now they're back outside again. They don't know what to do, and the weather just kind of, and they're done. So I always tell people, hold off. I have people already asking me, it was the middle of, or the beginning of April, when are you going to have tomato plants? Can I buy tomato plants? No, I'm not selling you tomato plants until the very end of the month, probably not until the first weekend in May, and that's just me. I don't want anybody to buy plants and not be successful with them. So don't take them home, put them inside, bring them back out again. No. To start the hardening off process, you want to start by bringing them out in a shaded area that is going to give them some access to a little bit of the wind and the other elements, but make it to where it's a protected area. They're coming from the inside area. You don't want to put them out in full sun with the wind all day long. That you will kill them. That's the fastest way to off your little seedlings. So put them in a shady spot for just a few hours, let them get used to some of the breeze, and then bring them back inside. The next day, do the same thing. Out in a shaded area for a little bit longer, maybe an additional hour or two, until you finally are up to about 6 hours a day in the shade. Then start putting them out in just a little bit of morning sun, and then move them to the shade after that. So maybe an hour or two in the morning, and then pull them back. Next day, maybe 3 or 4 hours in the morning, and then pull them back. Do this to where you are gradually exposing them to more sun, more of the elements, the wind, the rain, whatever, until they finally get to the point where you can probably leave them outside all day long. Again, that's going to take you about a week to 10 days to do this. If you are not home to be able to do this, because that's a lot of work, inside, outside, whatever, then set yourself up where either you've got a table or something outside where you can put the seedlings under, to where they get the angle of the morning sun to start with, but then they're protected in the shade for the rest of the day as the sun moves along. This might be up against a building or against a porch or whatever, someplace, or where you can put it. Or if you have trees where, okay, they're already starting to fill in, and you can put them out at the edge of the drip line in the morning, but then as the sun moves past, now those plants are in the shade, great. You don't have to worry about going out there and messing with them. If you have critters, raccoons, squirrels, whatever that wants to come by, or if it's your own chickens, whatever, that are going to come and try to eat these plants, then I recommend using insect netting to put over top of them and stake it down around it. Just cover them nicely to where they're still going to get the sun, they're still going to get the air, any rain that comes through, but the critters can't get into them unless they're really, really desperate, in which case they're probably destroying everything anyway. So I always recommend covering them in some way, shape, or form. I have had plants hardening off on my back porch on a table in dappled sunlight, and come out to find a squirrel in the middle of the table, in the middle of my seedlings, planting a nut in the soil of the seedlings. So
Thanks.
Thank you, sir. No, you're not getting that back. Go fetch, whatever. So you and I will just drape something over top to make sure that they're not getting into it. The only thing you want to do is make sure that if it's a really, really windy day, don't put them out. Don't rush it. Skip the day in those little containers. Even if you've had a fan blowing on them inside in the seed starting area, really, really gusting winds are going to be hard for them to take until they have been outside for at least 5, 6, 7 days. Eventually, yes, they're going to be able to handle that, and they should be able to handle that before you actually put them in their permanent home. Your final test, once you think that they've been outside all day, every day, they should be fine, they should be able to go in the ground, is to put them out in their permanent place, but don't plant them yet. Put them where they're gonna go for a full 24 hours, including overnight. When you come out the next day, if they seem perfectly fine, there doesn't seem to be any problems, then go ahead and plant away. But if they seem very droopy, if they seem like the leaves are a little bit discolored, if something seems off, don't risk it. Pull them back in, extend that hardening off process for another day or two, and then try again. When you have plants that are being grown in a pack, like this, they're getting protection from each other in this pack. And then when you have them all being grown in a tray where they're all next to each other, well, they're all getting support and protection from each other. So if you imagine these are taller plants, they're leaning against each other, for protection. They're being blocked from the wind a little bit. So they are better able to withstand the elements than if they're just in the pack by themselves in the spot where they're going to go. Or if you take them out of the packs and put them in individual containers and put them out where they're going to go. Now they're getting the full treatment of this is what it's going to feel like when you're in the ground, can you handle it kind of a thing. Do you have to do all of these things? No. You can wing it and you can keep your fingers crossed and hope for the best. But as somebody who has been doing this for a very long time, and it took me a very long time to figure out how to properly harden off my plants before putting them outside, I can tell you will have a much higher percentage of success, much less transplant shock, and a higher overall yield later on if you take these steps. If the plants suffer while you're in the hardening off process, back it off. I did this early this spring. I did it with my cauliflower plants. I started them off way too quickly, had them sitting out in the full sun, and they got sunburned. And all of the outer leaves burned like they were done, toast. So all of my plants got pulled back in because I realized that was my mistake. It was the area that I had them in was just too much sun too quickly. Those plants, I never did transplant them. I've allowed them to bounce back to see what would happen with them, and I'll show you here when we get done what they look like. Those outer leaves all died up, the inner leaves greened up and started to grow again. But if I had just gone ahead and continued with my process and put those plants out in the garden, number one, they probably would have died. But if I had gone ahead and just given them a few extra days and then planted them, they would still be stunted right now versus my other plants, which are already growing and are doing their thing. So it is heartbreaking when something like that happens because you have this whole tray of plants that you've been working on for, 2 months possibly. And now all of a sudden, I probably killed them, or I damaged them or whatever. It's just the nature of things. We're working with living organisms and they're going to react differently than we might think sometimes. And the tray that was right next to it did perfectly fine. That tray was just more sensitive for whatever reason. Was it a different variety? Was it just at a slightly different angle from the sun? Who knows? But those ones didn't do well. And that was my signal to go, okay, I need to slow it down a little bit, pull them back in, start the process over again, or just slow it out. So it's difficult and we get impatient, but it's for the best interest of the plants. And the same thing goes for your tomatoes and your other warm season stuff. You just want to take it slowly, especially since those plants are a little bit taller and they need to get used to the swaying of the winds or the occasional gust of wind or the rain or whatever. The other thing when we're hardening plants off, I always suggest is to reduce the amount of water that you are giving those plants before they're headed out into the gardens. Most gardeners are not or should not be watering that garden every single day. Once again, less frequent, more thorough waterings is what we want. We operated without irrigation for the majority of the time that we have farmed on a large scale or gardened on a large scale. And we relied a lot on mulch to help that. So timing our plantings for when the soil was still moist, making sure the plants were well watered before we transplanted them out, and then covering very thickly with mulch, and then just relying on rainwater. The reason I could do that was because I learned how to teach those plants to be drought tolerant. And part of that was the reduction of water as they were hardening off. So allowing them to dry out almost completely, not to the point where they're wilting, but making sure that it's not just the top of the soil that's dry before I water, but further down underneath is also dry. Again, we're trying to get those roots to direct down to look for water instead of up. And so if we're constantly keeping those plants wet at the surface, those roots have no need to go down deep. They're just relying on the water that's always available. It's also going to get the plants used to not having as much water when they get out into the garden. If you do water on a daily basis, again, once they get into the ground, they're not going to go those deep roots like we want them to, which doesn't just matter in terms of getting water. It matters in terms of getting nutrients. You know, generally speaking, that top inch or two may not have the nutrients that plant needs because it may have just recently been amended. You may have just added that compost. It's not available to those plants yet. The deeper down they can go to search for those nutrients, the better off they are. So, soak your plants down when they're in their hardening off stage and let them start to dry out before you water them again. This is going to depend on the size of the container. If they're tiny little plugs, then yeah, you're going to have to do this every day because it's going to dry out very quickly. But you have them in larger, 3.5, 4-inch pots. You may not have to be doing this every day, which is fantastic. The plants are going to appreciate that once you get them out into the soil. When you're ready to transplant, make sure that you're digging your hole. For most of your plants, again, you are going to plant at the same soil level as what the plant was in the container, with the exception of the tomatoes, the peppers, and the eggplant. Those are all typically vining type crops and they can handle being planted more deeply. With the peppers, I generally will go ahead and go up a couple of inches on the stem. Same with the eggplant. With the tomatoes, I am planting them as deep as I possibly can. Again, we want that strong root system, and so everywhere it touches the soil to the stem, it's going to root. So I will leave just the top couple of inches of a tomato plant. I will strip all the rest of the leaves off and I will dig a hole deep enough to be able to drop that guy in there and mound the soil around it, pat it down firmly, water it in really well, and then let it go. Is it going to delay how quickly that plant grows? Maybe a little bit, but that stronger root system is going to make up for it in the long run because it's going to allow that plant to produce much more fruit than it would if it was kind of skinny and spindly and just growing up, because then at that point it can't really support the fruit that it wants to grow. So you're going to end up with a thicker stem, you're going to end up with a better root system. But for all the rest of them, you don't want to bury them. Again, for the same reason that we don't want to do that when we're potting them up. We don't want the water to be constantly at that stem, causing it to rot and eventually just kind of fall over and be done. So it's going to weaken the plant. So same soil level across the board. Make sure that you water the plants really, really well before you transplant them, and make sure that the soil that you're planting into is watered very, very well. This is going to reduce the transplant shock. So if the plant has been watered and then the soil is also watered, I oftentimes will actually fill that transplant hole with water. That way I know it has enough water in an immediate area around the root ball to be able to feed off of once it sort of dries out in its own root ball. So then set it down in there, backfill it with your soil, cover it with your mulch, and then leave it alone. And just check after you've transplanted it to be sure that it's not showing any signs of major transplant shock. So it's going to look a little wilty, possibly. That's just sort of the nature of it has to get used to its environment, but it shouldn't be falling over on its side. It shouldn't be wilting and then not perking back up again in the overnights. It's not unusual because, especially if you've got a day like this when you've transplanted and then the next day there's not a cloud in the sky and it's fully sunny, even though the air temperatures are cool, that sun is going to beat down. Those leaves will naturally bend themselves over to reduce the surface area of the leaf, which means it's reducing the amount of transpiration. It's not sweating as much. So that's a protective mechanism. That is okay. It doesn't necessarily mean that the plant needs more water, so check your soil before you water. It just means it's trying to protect itself, and as it cools off in the evening and the overnights, it'll perk back up again. That's normal. It not perking back up again is a sign of transplant shock. So when you see things like that happen, just check your soil moisture first. I always recommend watering your soil to a depth of 6 inches and then not watering again until it dries out in that top 3 inches. So it has a chance to be able to, down at that between that 4 and 6 inch depth, to be able to take up that moisture. In the first week, I sort of break that rule just a little bit because I want to make it as easy as possible for that plant to get what it needs while it's rebounding. Okay. So for the first week, I'm not letting it really dry out in the top 2 inches. I mean, the top 2 inches is about as far as I'll go, and then I will water again just to make sure. We don't want to drown it. We want to make sure it has ample moisture available. And then after that, I just let it go. So if the wilting is one sign, yellowing of the leaves is going to be another sort of sign that maybe it's in a little bit of shock. That should resolve itself. If it does not, then you need to be checking for your soil nutrients. If it's not nutrients, then it's definitely transplant shock. I don't really recommend digging plants up again and trying again because that's just going to increase the amount of shock. It may be something to where you just need to provide it a little bit of protection and then maybe provide it with a little bit of emergency nutrients. I don't recommend fertilizing heavily when you transplant because the plant is already in sort of a state of shock. It needs to settle in first before it can really effectively take up those nutrients. Now, if you have something that is a soil amendment or a natural sort of plant food that is not chemically based, it is very, very low in nutrients, but also has kind of encourages good microbial bacteria. Like I use Elm Dirt's plant juice, and I will use that when I transplant. There's another one called Organic Rev. There are several varieties out there that are meant to sort of just stimulate the microbial activity in the soil, not necessarily feed the plant, it's feeding the soil. Okay. That I will absolutely do as a way to sort of get that plant off to its best start. I'll do that when I'm transplanting too. As I'm potting it up, I will water with that, or you can dip the roots in it and when you transplant. So that is good. But I wouldn't take your Miracle Grow and water the plant with it immediately after transplanting. I would wait a week and then start your regular sort of nutritional or fertilizing regimen. Okay. That's basically it. That's the fundamentals of transplanting. It's really making sure that when you're potting up to a container that's going to give enough soil volume for that little transplant to get what it needs before it finally makes its way out into the ground. And then when you do put them out into the ground, make sure that it has been adjusted to the outdoor conditions and it's ready to be put in the ground, and then making sure it just has sort of a smooth transition.
For more information about today's topic and to find all the ways you can get in touch with me or support the show, go to justgrowsomethingpodcast.com. Until next time, my gardening friends, keep learning and keep growing.